Hello and welcome to this episode of Moving Forward. I'm your host, Amy Clark, and in this podcast, we aim to give you the insights you need to develop a high-performing learning culture to future-proof your organization. Whether you're an HR professional, a learning and development coach, or anyone looking to give their team a leg up, we'll give you the tips and tricks you need to get your people learning and moving forward. In each episode, we invite an expert to join us to unpack some key statements designed to get them giving us their best insights. And today, we're talking about learning in a globalized world. You probably have people in your company from different cultures and different countries, but what does that mean for their learning and development? To help me unpack this topic, I've invited the Good Habits Head of Localization, Maria Rosales, to give us her insights. Welcome to the show, Maria.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me.
To start off, I'd just like to find out a bit about what you do, who you are, and what led you to become our Head of Localization.
Well, it's a bit of a long story, but I will give you the brief version. So I'm from Spain originally, and I'm a translator and interpreter, in this case from English and French to Spanish. And 6 years ago, I actually started working for Good Habits as a freelance translator. So I was responsible for localizing all of the content that we want to put in our library for our Spanish clients. And from there, I became actually a team lead for Southern Europe content, so Italy, Spain, Portugal. And the more we expanded, the more countries we have to localize for. And at the end, I actually moved to the Netherlands, and now I'm here responsible for all of the markets and all of these wonderful teams localizing the content.
So you're definitely the right person to give us a bit of insight, because we're obviously dealing with customers and clients and learners all over the world, learning in different languages. And I think that really resonates with a lot of companies these days as they're trying to get the talent that they need. You know, they're more and more looking beyond the borders of their countries.
Definitely, that's a reality for so many companies, especially we also see it here in the Netherlands, where there's a very diverse workforce, and we need to cater for the needs of all of these different learners, but also for the different cultures, because there's also a nuance there on how we learn.
Interesting. So that's a perfect segue into the first statement we have for you. And that is, English learning content is perfect for a multilingual workforce.
That's a very tricky one. I think the problem with that statement is the word perfect. So, of course, it's something that we can use. It will be undeniable that English is a fundamental tool for international communication, right? Like in a company that is multilingual. But then at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's ideal at all. And we see several pitfalls with that approach. One of them is that there is a shift in focus. So suddenly the people become too preoccupied trying to learn the language and decipher the information, and not in gaining a proper skill or knowledge that they want for their job. So that's definitely a pitfall.
So the language difference is almost distracting from the message.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that we also see is an increase in the cognitive load. So your brain is so busy deciphering the words that then they don't have the energy to actually gain the knowledge. And in this case, it happens especially with, for example, digital skills courses. Imagine that you are trying to learn Excel and you're already quite bad with formulas and you are confused in your own language. The moment that you try to do that in a different language that is not your mother tongue, it becomes really challenging and frustrating for the learner.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I've experienced this myself as well, reading the news in Dutch.
Yeah, especially with numbers, we see that that happens all the time. But another thing that is very important to take into account is that suddenly when the content is in English, it could become less relatable and less relevant for some of these multilingual learners. Imagine that you're learning about how to manage your finances, but all of those examples are about the UK retirement plan, or I'm giving you ideas for products in UK banks, or the examples are in pounds about how much you should be saving. So, of course, the learner will be thinking, how does this apply to me? Am I really learning something? So that's another of the pitfalls of learning in a language and a culture that is not yours.
Tell me more about learning in our mother tongue, because I imagine that it really does make things easier. Are there any best practices we can look to in this case?
That's a great question. And yeah, for sure, already for many decades, there are research that have proven that learning in your mother tongue is fundamental. This especially applies for early childhood, but it's actually something that applies throughout your whole life, so also for adult learning. And it's one of the best practices also from the UNESCO for education institutions that you do need to learn in your mother tongue. Sadly, that's not the reality in the world. Actually, more than 50% of the children in the world don't get to learn in their mother tongue, and that really hinders their development.
It's very difficult because coming from a very diverse country, I also have experienced that with so many languages, how do you formulate education that is accessible to everybody? And most often the argument for that is, but learning in English is great because English is the business language. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, that's definitely very challenging, especially in some countries like South Africa. And we need to make sure that at least those children reach that proficiency level in English, and then they will be able to build a foundation to learn other skills and other knowledge. But if they don't really master English in this case, then you're really hindering their development. And there's going to be more higher statistics on dropouts during high school and so on. So actually it will affect them their whole life just because they didn't have a chance to learn in their mother tongue. So it's something fundamental. It's a fundamental right.
Yes. And then this would be something applying to organizations that they'd have to keep in mind. They're having people from diverse backgrounds who maybe didn't get that foundation in their schooling, but still have really valuable skills. And I suppose the solution then is clearly separate your learning the language from learning the content. And if learning in your home language means you get to really internalize it better, it seems like the solution to me.
Yes, I don't know if I have anything to add to that.
No, you don't have to. This brings me to our next statement, which I think ties nicely, and that is localization is a luxury. So let's start, maybe just unpack exactly what do we mean by localization?
I think that's a great starting point because I feel that a lot of people get confused about localization and translation and what's the exact difference there. So normally when we talk about localization, we refer to the whole process of adapting a product or a service to a new target audience. And that means not only the language, but also the culture. So you could think of something that is not just translation word per word, but something that looks at storytelling elements, facts and figures, institutions, regulations that are being mentioned in those learning materials. So sometimes even visual elements. There's so many different elements that compose the learning materials that we need to adapt and make sure that are being catered for that audience.
So give me an example. Let's say we're talking about a first aid course. What would that look like in a localization versus translation?
That's a great example. So in this case, they have different regulations. So of course, if you look at the UK and you look at Spain, Portugal, even within the European Union, you have already many different laws. But it's also about, for example, measurements, units. So you will be seeing different systems, of course, in the UK and again in Spain or in other countries. In this case, actually, one of the courses about first aid, I translated it myself for Good Habits. It was one of my first ones. And we even discovered that some of the procedures were not the same. So the best practices in Spain and in the UK were completely different. And they even had different products that they didn't exist in the other market. So as a localization specialist or as a translator, you really need to look into all of the details to make sure that the people at the other end are understanding and that they are really relating to that content.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, your first response needs to be based on the context in which you're existing. Otherwise, you might just do the wrong emergency procedure. This sounds like quite a comprehensive process to go through. Maybe break it down. Who's actually doing this kind of stuff? Is it something that anyone might have been exposed to?
Yes, it's a lot of different steps to actually get localization right. In the case of Good Habits and in the case of many other companies actually and any industry that you can think of, there's always behind a localization specialist. And that's a person that is native or proficient in the target language, but also that lives within the target culture. So they have a high cultural sensitivity and attention for detail, and that people will be responsible to really cater for the target audience and also flag any potential issues, right? So imagine that we are localizing a course about mental health. They will be the ones saying that this could be a sensitive topic in some cultures or that we need to approach it in a different way. So it's actually a feedback loop, and they also have really good, valuable input to put back into how we create materials, taking into account all of these different flavors and cultures.
And does this happen also in the entertainment industry? Because we see a lot of sort of globalized content, mainly from, of course, America and the UK, but are we seeing this in other forums as well?
I think that's the beauty of localization, that sometimes you are not aware that it's happening because it's invisible to you, but somehow when it goes wrong, you really miss it. And there are some really great examples of companies that take the localization to the next level. And one of my favorite cases is from the movie from Pixar, Inside Out. So I don't know if you have watched it, but at some point...
I love it.
Okay, it's a great movie. And at some point, there's a child that refuses to eat her vegetables because she finds the taste disgusting. So she's a bit disgusted by that. And in the original movie, that was broccoli. But then when they were localizing this movie for the Japanese audience, they heard that the audience there didn't find, well, especially the children, they didn't find broccoli disgusting at all. They loved it.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so there must be very healthy children. And in this case, the problem they had was with green bell peppers. So they went through the whole trouble of changing the animation of several scenes, so it actually had the same emotional impact. So in this case, it's not even about just if it's correct or accurate. It's also about how you want to resonate with the audience. And I think it's so valuable and precious that a company is willing to take those steps to make sure that they are really reaching the right...
Yeah, I'm actually remembering that scene. I think it's when she's learning the emotion of disgust.
Yeah.
And of course, hey, movies can be educational too. And if you're somebody learning to identify emotions and it's something like you really enjoy it, now you must be disgusted by it, you are going to be confused. So.
Yeah, especially if it's addressed to children, then it's even more difficult.
Yeah.
So I think they did a wonderful job there. And it happens sometimes on a really superficial level. But I have also a funny example that probably you will not know. Is from Spain. So you know the movie Terminator 2?
Yeah.
So I think that there's a catchphrase there that is really popular. I think it's "Hasta la vista, baby." I don't know if you're familiar with that. But the funny thing is, like, of course, if you grew in Spain, you don't recognize that catchphrase at all because the character is already dubbed into Spanish. So it wouldn't be any special if he just said "Hasta la vista, baby" while speaking Spanish. So in the case of Spain, it actually says "Sayonara, baby." And I think it's a much better catchphrase. And it really, it has the same impact that the original one had for the English audience.
That's so funny. But you can already imagine how putting that in a learning context, that it would make a huge difference because suddenly you feel taken along for the journey and it all makes much more sense to you. And I think also localizing to wit and humor. I mean, of course, good training content can be humorous and engaging and talk about pop culture. It doesn't have to be a textbook.
Yeah.
You can bring humor along too with it.
Exactly. We look at learning like when you were in high school and you had that favorite teacher and they knew what will resonate with you, which examples they needed to use to connect with the teenagers in that case. So we are doing the same. And sometimes it's going to be humor and sometimes it's going to be facts and figures and sometimes it's going to be a law or history. And all of that is going to be missed if you don't have a proper localization process in place.
I think you've given us some really good insights here, but what's the final word on the statement? Is localization a luxury?
It's definitely not a luxury, especially if you're going for an effective and inclusive learning environments, then you need to address that.
All right, it's time for our final statement of the show, and that is culture creates the context for learning. So what can you say about that?
I think that's a very accurate statement. And we already discussed it before, but context is everything. If I'm not understanding the references, it's not going to be relevant for me. And therefore, I'm going to stop paying attention and probably the learning outcome is going to be worse. We were talking before about some examples with digital skills, but it also happens with soft skills. Things even like communication styles or how we approach negotiation. That's a very cultural thing. I remember with Good Habits, we were also translating one of the courses about negotiation. And we saw that in India, for example, is so ingrained in the culture that the guidelines that you need to give for a UK person or an Indian person or a Portuguese person are going to be completely different. So that framework is already different and you need to take that into account even to develop the materials. Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier that I wasn't quite sure about, and that is cultural sensitivity. What really does that mean?
Yeah, that's difficult to define. I think it's to be very attuned to the differences in the original culture. So you need to be very familiar, in this case, with the UK, with their values, but also with how they see other cultures too. And then you need to be attuned to what that means in your target audience, right? So in my case, I need to know very well also the Spanish culture, like what's valuable there, what's preferred. And in some cases, it's going to even go beyond the text or even the visual elements or the storytelling. It's going to go to the actual format format of education, right? So there are many models that explain this. Like in some cultures, people prefer something more visual instead of something verbal. Other people prefer very detailed instructions. Sometimes this is actually individual preference. So I also like, because it becomes a bit fussy, that difference between, is this a personal preference? Is this a cultural thing? But there are many studies that highlight that overall there are those specific cultural differences. And some people prefer to learn in groups because they value more community, for example. And other groups actually will prefer, the detailed instructions, or they need more context. So all of that is cultural too, and you need to take it into account.
Can you give us an example of quite a clear one that you've come across in your history?
Well, in my experience, I can tell you that, especially with the German audience, we do see the need for detailed instructions and to be very thorough, and also to have very reliable sources. However, in other countries, you see that sources are not so important, and perhaps it's more about storytelling and the impact of the visual elements. So definitely those are already there, even on a European level. Yeah.
Yes, I have to say I've actually experienced this myself, because obviously I do a fair amount of writing, and especially when you're referring to sort of facts and figures or things like that, we kind of say studies show this, or trends have shown that. And that's quite helpful for demonstrating the point and giving credibility. But then it comes to the localization team and they're like, which studies? Who said it? When was it done? Because they know, we have the references, but they know that their audience isn't going to trust this without telling me exactly when and where it happened.
Yeah, that means that they really know the German audience very well, and they can already anticipate their needs. So we are already creating that perfect product just for them, because we know what they value.
That's amazing. This seems like quite a lot to take into account with with your workforce. So what would we say for learning and development managers? What can they actually do about their multicultural workforce? They can't feasibly please everybody, I imagine.
Yeah, I think that the first thing will be awareness. To be really aware the people that you have in your team, which languages are their mother tongue, and also how they prefer to learn. So I think it will be very good to be transparent about, okay, what are your needs? And then find a provider or create the materials that are, catering to those needs that they have.
Yeah, I guess like everything, it's start a conversation and see what people like. While we're talking about the localization process, have you ever come across a case that it went kind of wrong?
Yes, I have some that are perhaps too excessive. So as with everything in life, you need to also find that middle ground. And I remember that there was a written interview with a UK expert. And I think at some point that man was talking that he was going for fish and chips, and he was going to a pub. And in the Spanish translation, it completely became about having paella and doing super Spanish things. But then it wouldn't make any sense, because you're looking at the pictures of that man in his British house, and you clearly know that he's not dancing flamenco at night. So it's like that's taking it to another level, and that's when you go hyper local, and then suddenly it's not relatable, or it's too relatable, but you know that fantasy of that person being from the UK is being broken. So you also need to be aware of that. It's possible to overdo localization.
Yeah, like it shatters the picture a little bit, and suddenly it's distorted and it doesn't make sense anymore.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's talk more about this, because also in the localization process, you're sort of stereotyping almost. Like, where's the balance? You want to cater to a market, but you also need to be culturally sensitive and not put people in boxes.
Yeah. Again, just the example I gave you with the flamenco dancing. So just because I'm Spanish, it doesn't mean that I can do it or that I even like it. So again, that cultural sensitivity is key for a localization specialist, and also research to understand exactly what, and that's why sometimes one of the requirements that we have for our localization specialists is that they need to be living in that country. Because even though I'm Spanish, then if I leave my country and for 20 years I live somewhere else, that doesn't mean that I'm really, in sync with what's happening with the sensitivities of, the current moment. So that's always very important, and to be willing to make changes. And it also brings me to another point that is a bit philosophical, but I think is interesting, and is that maybe you do a good localization job today, but will it hold up in 20 years?
I was about to ask that, because cultures change over time, like anything. Everything changes. So how do you maintain a relevant library of learning content?
Yeah, actually, we need to keep an eye on that all the time, and to do this quality assurance and to make sure that it's still relevant. And that means that sometimes 3 years later, you will need to change those examples because they are not acceptable anymore. They are not easily understood anymore. So again, cultural sensitivity is key. Yeah.
So then it kind of feels like the safe bet would be to go generic, which...
Oh, but that will be so boring.
boring.
And then again, people will not properly learn. They will not feel engaged, and then you will have really poor outcomes, and it's not going to be effective. But of course, that's very tempting, but it's not the way to go if you really want to learn and have a bit of fun.
Have a bit of fun too, yeah, for sure. I mean, it feels like it's definitely a fine line between getting it in that balance between relatable and not too drastic. On that note, I mentioned earlier we talk a lot about being exposed to American and British pop culture. How much should we be looking to minimize those influences? It's become almost like the global culture. What is global culture even?
Yeah, I love the question, and it's a bit of a debate sometimes even for us. So there was like this image of Drake, now I have it on my head, like the singer. And I remember I gave feedback like, this is not going to be an easily understood reference, because sometimes it's also translating and localizing is an exercise of empathy. So you need to think, okay, so I'm a 50-year-old worker in Portugal in a small, medium company. Am I really going to understand who Drake is? Of course, we need to think sometimes of stereotypes, and the answer in this case is going to be probably he's not going to understand it. So we need to or localize that reference or remove the reference. So again, you really need to think, will that person understand me? Will I connect with this person? And yeah, that's, I think, the beauty of localization.
I love what you just said. Localization is an exercise in empathy.
Yeah, you can quote me on that.
I will. But say some more about that. I love that.
Yeah, I think it's always about taking into account the perspective of others, and again, not only of the one single individual, but the whole culture. So in a way, you are almost like representing your country and understanding what's acceptable, what's not, what's desirable, what could connect. And then you just create the best possible story for them so they can, you're giving them the framework. Yeah.
I feel like framing it as empathy really changes the perception that this could be like a lot of hard work to do for your teams. If you're a learning and development coach, now suddenly by looking for localized content, you're being empathetic to your team.
Definitely.
That appeals to me a lot.
Yeah, you are being inclusive. You are taking care of your team. You're really putting them in the best possible spot to learn. And And
as we know, diversity and inclusion, specifically inclusion, is such an important and difficult part about managing teams these days. So something also that struck my mind when we're talking about localizing content towards cultures and stuff, you could run the risk, I imagine, of also ending up with like different stories. So say you have people in your team, one person's French, one person's Spanish, they're getting the same content, but they've been tweaked. They might end up learning totally different lessons. Is that something that happens?
Yeah, no, we really try to avoid that. So you need to keep an eye for it. In this case, we have very strong educational foundations for our lessons and our courses, and we need to keep those intact, meaning that the learning goals need to be the same. However, where we are allowing that different flavor is in everything else, right? So the voiceovers, the actors, the visual elements, the storytelling, the facts and figures can be different, right? But then the core message needs to remain the same. So it's only about the details, and that's why we are sure that we are delivering the same experience for everyone. But of course, actually, if you want to deliver that same impact, you need to be different in how you present and serve this content.
You know, this brings me to something that just popped into my mind recently. We've been doing quite a bit of writing and content about mental health, and when doing research for the products, you see quite a big difference in the mental health stats from country to country. And so the trouble is when you're writing for like a global audience, but like what stats do you use? Definitely the solution then is to change it. And it paints a little bit of a different picture in every country, which is difficult. But at least I found the trend does sort of remain the same. So
yeah, in the case of mental health, sadly, we are all doing quite poorly, apparently. But I know what you mean. You definitely need to go for the right facts and figures so it resonates. I have a similar example about that. I don't know if I ever shared it with you, but it was about a course we have on happiness. And the first lessons, of course, they want just to paint a picture of the context, like how is your country doing? Are people happy? And in the case of the Netherlands and the UK, people were quite happy overall. Like if you were looking at the United Nations Index, it will be in the higher ranks. But then when we were localizing this content for the Indian audience, where it's actually English what we do there, we discovered that it was in the last positions of the ranking. So suddenly that whole context and the framework has to be changed. Not the core message and, how do you increase your happiness at work? What can you do? Job crafting and all of that. But yeah, those first pages of the article needed to be changed completely because it's a different picture. And you also need to be sensitive to that, right? Like this person is starting from a different point of view.
Yes, completely different compared to, say, Scandinavian countries that always achieve really highly on these happiness indexes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Something else that comes to mind then is if you had a multicultural team, but they're in the same country, right? You maybe don't need to know so much about the stats from where they're from, but it is a nice learning opportunity. Like, hey, did you know that in my home country, this is what's going on versus in your home country? Sounds like a nice starting point for some inclusive conversations.
Definitely, you can improve communication and people get to know each other much better, and also understanding again their angle, right? Like maybe I'm taking now a course and I can understand why maybe you negotiate the way you do, or how your communication style is related to your culture. That happens all the time, how direct people are, right? Or not direct. So yeah, definitely it's a great opportunity to put that on the table.
Sounds like a fun assignment to give to your team. Come take your training material and compare the differences. And what does that say about how we work together?
Yeah.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. I think that brings me to the end of the questions that I had for you. To end off, do you have any final key takeaways you want to leave for our HR professionals, our learning and development coaches? What do they need to take away from this?
I will say that for me it will be a win if they understood what localization is, and that it's not a luxury, and that people really need to learn in their mother tongue and in a cultural framework that they understand, right? If we want to be effective, the content needs to be relevant and relatable. So yeah, that's my main message.
Thank you so much. And I think for me, I'd like to take away the idea that while you should cater for differences, keep an eye on creating a consistent experience for all of your team, so no one's walking away with a completely different understanding of the same topic.
Definitely. We need to go for consistency.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for those insights and for joining me today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise.
And thank you for joining us. If you learned something new from this episode, please share it with a friend or a colleague. You might help them move their people forward too. And while you're at it, give us a like or a subscribe. It helps us reach more people. Thanks so much. Until next time.